Hey guys, and welcome to the first video for chapter 18, where we'll be talking about the nomadic people of Central and Northern Asia, the Turks and the Mongols. You see the two pictures here, a gentleman here kind of recreating the lifestyle of his ancestors, on horseback riding along the Central Asian steppes, and this gentleman right here down at the bottom, a statue for the famous Mongol ruler, Chinggis or Genghis Khan. Before we get into the Mongols, first I want to talk about the Turkish people. Now, Turkish is kind of a general term. We think of it today mostly as referring to people from Turkey. But if you went back 1,000 years, the people living in what today is Turkey were not Turkish. They eventually migrated there over the course of centuries from Central Asia. So they would be much more closely related to people from what today would be Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Western China, Mongolia, than they would be to people in the Middle East, Arabs or Persians, people of that nature. Right. So first we'll start talking about them. I'll show you guys on some maps and things about the regions that we're talking about. But first, just kind of understanding about their lifestyle. And these guys were nomads. They were nomads because of where they lived. They lived on the steppes of Central Asia. And they were pastoralists. Pastoralists are by nature nomadic, right? They're herders. These central nomadic steppes, they're fairly arid, not desert. Obviously, you got grass there, but you don't get a ton of rain, so it's difficult for supporting large-scale agriculture. They herded animals, goats and sheep in particular. Cattle were not well situated for the steppes. Kind of the smaller, tough grass was a little bit better for the goats and the sheep. But herders have to constantly move to find better grazing ground. They made total use of their animals, obviously for food, also for shelter. You see these cylindrical tents called yurts. Much of the way that teepees for Native Americans, they were relatively easy to put up and take down. They were very mobile, but also they had to be able to withstand some pretty harsh weather conditions, especially in the winter. Now, this nomadic lifestyle made them completely dependent on their horses, and they were exceptionally skilled on horseback, these both Turkish people and Mongols, not only just for transportation, but also for warfare. They made a very, very fearsome force when they were fighting on horseback in terms of light cavalry, able to fire a bow and arrow from a horseback without using any hands to direct the animal. These were people who were taught how to ride a horse from the time they were toddlers. From 2-3 years of age, they were put on horseback. And they were considered only as good as they were on a horse. Once a older gentleman was no longer able to ride a horse, it was no longer considered worthwhile within many of these societies. So the steppe, kind of the environment of it created this nomadic pastoralist lifestyle and made them very dependent on their animals. They were involved in trade, though. Nomadic people actively seek trade with settled people because nomads don't really manufacture much. They're constantly on the move, so you need more of a settled, established lifestyle in order to engage in large-scale manufacturing, and nomads don't do that. Also, their mobility allowed them to engage in long-distance trade, so they could do business with a number of different people. Now, nomadic society was fairly simple. Really, it was just broken down into two social classes. You had nobles and commoners. It was also fairly fluid, right? You could move up and down fairly easy in this, compared to a lot of other societies, at least. Noble power was mostly clan-based, right? It was based around large family units, and it was relatively local. Bravery in combat could result in rising up from commoners to noble, right? These were warrior people. They regarded bravery in high esteem. Some leaders could achieve a higher rank known as Khan. Khan means ruler, in kind of a common Turkish language, and they were mostly military leaders. They did not rule much directly. It was more through alliances of tribes. It wouldn't be until Genghis came along that he turned that title into meaning more of an emperor or king. Now, in terms of religion, originally they were polytheistic or possibly animistic, meaning more of just a general worshiping of spirits. Because of this, they had a high regard for shamans, kind of mystic holy men that would convene with nature and with spirits. Obviously, they're still in existence to this day. Eventually, though, they did start to come into contact with more formalized religions, especially Islam. Through trade, they came into contact with a lot of different ones, such as Manichaeism, Nestorian Christianity, Buddhism, obviously. But Islam was the one that really kind of took hold because of trade and conquest with Persians and the Arab community as well. Now, here I'll show some of the spread of Islam. So by the 6th and 7th century, Islam had completely spread to Persia and even into some areas of Central Asia. Turkestan is one region that we'll be coming back to in a sec. And then by the 7 and 800s, it started to spread down into India as well, right? So Islam was really going to be the dominant major religion that would have the most impact on the Turkish peoples. Now, for Turkish empires, there are only two that we're going to be discussing. Where these people come from is kind of it's not a true nation in the sense that we think of today. This area, Turkestan, which, the area that I circled before, this is kind of a general approximation of it. There is no country called it. In fact, it overlaps over a number of ones. Compare it to the bottom map, that shows the current borders. You see some of the larger ones, southern Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, the Caspian Sea. Right, this land right here. That's generally viewed as being the western border of it. But it goes all the way into western China. So this is considered to be kind of the historic heartland of the Turkish or Turkic people. And the first major group to emerge from there and start to make a kind of impact on major civilizations were the Seljuk Turks. The 8th and the 10th century, they were living on the border of Abbasid territory. Okay, so here's your Abbasid Empire kind of at its height, and throughout Persia, even into what today would be Afghanistan and so forth. And so Turkestan, here's your Caspian Sea. They would be up along the border, kind of the northern and the eastern borders of Abbasid territory. And by the late 10th century, they were starting to really, kind of work their way more and more into Abbasid territory, and they were actually serving an awful lot in Abbasid armies. They relied on the warriors of these Central Asian nomads to kind of bolster their forces. Well, eventually it got to the point that they were the ones in control. And you see this in the appointment of the Sultan. In 1055, the Abbasid caliphs recognized that the Turks were in control. They were the ones running the show. And so the Abbasid caliph granted the Turkish ruler the title of Sultan, which is a Turkish term for ruler or chieftain. The caliphs essentially became figureheads, and the Seljuk Turks were the ones ruling Baghdad here. Right? That was their capital. They were the ones in control of Baghdad up until the Mongols came in and toppled the Abbasid territory. But where they really started to set their sights on more was in this area here, which is Anatolia. Anatolia was a much more attractive area in terms of agriculture. This was the historic breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire. But in wanting to come into here, obviously that would bring them into conflict with the Byzantine Empire. Right? They're still in existence at that time. They were able to win a very decisive victory over the Byzantines in 1071. And after that, the floodgates were basically open, and they started to move in more and more. A lot of the people living in Anatolia actually preferred them over the Byzantine rulers, so it wasn't looked like they were being, these horrible tyrants. And slowly, over the next couple of centuries, they began replacing Byzantine authority. The other Turkish empire are the Ghaznavid Turks. And the Ghaznavid Turks get their name from the original ruler of this dynasty, Mahmud of Ghazni. Remember, we talked about him back in chapter 16. He led raids into northern India, but eventually created permanent settlements. And by the 13th century, the Turks had controlled most of northern India, and this led to the creation of the Delhi Sultanate. You see in 1236, kind of the thicker outline here, and then by 1335 had taken over most of the Indian subcontinent. Okay, this blue line for Tamerlane, we'll actually be talking about him in a later video. So we talked an awful lot about the Delhi Sultanate in chapter 16, but it's important to understand the major impact of their rule was the consolidation of Islamic power in northern India. Mahmud was a zealous foe of Buddhism and Hinduism. He was largely responsible for driving Buddhism out of India altogether, and he encouraged large numbers of Hindus to convert to Islam. All right, so that's it for just a overview of the Turks, and in the next video we will get into talking about the Mongols.